All right. Good morning and welcome back. So, we talked last class about, we started talking about the virtue of prudence, what prudence is and how to exercise it, how to begin to work on it, how to begin to formulate it. We start today by looking at two ways that we practice the vice of imprudence. So prudence is right discernment and application. Imprudence is false or bad or wrong discernment and application of the self. And as we talked earlier, prudence is meant to be kind of a mean, a golden mean, averaging between two extremes, too much and too little. So imprudence can be seen in two ways. The first way is thoughtlessness. That one acts too quickly without a proper grasp of the situation. The idea of just charging in, head first. But if one does not have all the facts, all the details, it can put one in danger. So thoughtlessness is the first way one can exercise imprudence. Not thinking, not really discerning too much. The other way that one can practice imprudence is in the opposite way, being too thoughtful. What we call irresoluteness. That you are so thinking and deliberating on what to do that you don't act. You're so plagued by consideration that you don't actually do what you need to do. There comes a point when there's only so much we can deliberate about, and we have to act. So irresoluteness is the other way of being imprudent. So there's thoughtlessness, not thinking enough. Irresoluteness, thinking too much. So there has to be a mean whereby we think enough, but not too much or too little. And then put it into action. Rare indeed is that situation when we have to act so immediately that we can't absolutely think about it. There's always usually some time for deliberation. But this brings up looking at the biggest challenge of the moral life. The biggest challenge in doing any of this is knowing what is the right thing to do and doing it. To translate from knowing into doing. It's enough of a struggle to know what is right or true or just. It is then another to do it. We may know what we need to do, but it may be difficult, and oftentimes it can be difficult. Why? Because there are so many things that we can factor in that weigh on us about why to do something. We may worry about how others may react in doing it. We may freeze up in perhaps thinking, we are not capable of doing it. We may lose courage because it is something hard and people may not like us for it. Hence why we need the virtue of fortitude, which we'll talk about when we get to that virtue. But we must start with knowing. Before we can do, we must know. We cannot be mere agents of action. We must think as well. We need to have some deliberation, some thought, some formation on what it is that is so important that we need to do. To discern it and then to apply it. But how is it that we can be such moral agents that we can know and then do? Is it merely intellect? Is it merely the will? Is it something else? In looking at this specifically in a Catholic perspective, the primary agent in the human person for the exercise of the virtues, for the exercise of the moral life, is that which we call the conscience. Now, what comes to mind when you see the word conscience? Anything come to mind? Yes.
Like the little voice in your head.
Little voice in your head?
It's something uniquely human.
Something uniquely human. True. Others?
Like your internal moral guide.
Moral guide, moral compass. Yeah. Not enough people watching Pinocchio anymore. Let me bring up Jiminy Cricket. I'm your conscience, Pinocchio. He says that. He says that in there. Nobody appreciates the classics. What is conscience, though? How can we define it? The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines conscience as the interior voice of the human being. The interior voice of the human being, within whose heart the inner law of God is inscribed. I will repeat that. The interior voice of a human being, within whose heart the inner law of God is inscribed. So to start off with, correctly so, this is something uniquely human. It is not something we have encountered yet in any other creature. But it is something that is internal to us. That directs us towards, ultimately, the obedience of the law of God. Why? Because we are not completely born with a blank slate. There are some philosophers or ideas who say, we are a tabula rasa. We are a completely blank slate upon which we just pour everything in. No, that's not the case. In studying and understanding these things from a Christian Catholic perspective, God inscribes, places into our hearts the basics of his law. We know some things are not good, are not to be done on a natural basis. What's perhaps the first thing we know not to do?
Don't touch the hot stove.
Some people have to learn that. Some boys have to learn that. No, I didn't have to learn that. Far deeper than that, though. It is an act of harm, you're right, in the right direction. What is something that we naturally seem to know?
Not to kill.
Not to kill, right? Especially not to kill the innocent. We can argue over the merits of doing that with one, who has committed a crime or whatnot, but especially not to kill someone who has done nothing wrong. Any other ideas? Any other things you might say we naturally know? What about the practice of obedience? Obedience of proper authority, as long as they don't tell us to do something that we know is wrong. Respect towards others. Respect towards parents. It's not that God just has this outside law, the nice table of commandments, right? That he just imposes on humanity. This is what you must do now. No, this is just, as it were, an outward manifestation of what he has already inscribed within us, the law that he has written within our hearts. To be able to say, we should do this, we should not do that. John Henry Newman, a Anglican and Catholic theologian of the 19th century, says, conscience is a messenger of him who, both in nature and in grace, speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules as by his representatives. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Why? Because conscience is the first thing that directs us morally. So conscience is the initial moral agent in the human person. It is the initial decider. We decide to act or not to act based on our own conscience. It is also the agent we are first responsible to. No one else will ever judge us as harshly as our own conscience will. We may be judged by the courts, we may be judged by society, we may be judged by our friends. None of them will judge us as harshly and as deeply as our conscience will. Why? Because our conscience is privy to all the details about us. We know our own deliberations. We know our own struggles. We know our own knowledge or lack of knowledge, our own moral compass. And if we act or don't act in accord with it, it will impact us. We must be responsible to our conscience first and foremost. As moral agents, as those who are able to act in a moral manner, we must first and foremost do what our conscience tells us to do. Newman again, in talking about this, he says, certainly if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink perhaps to the Pope first, but still actually to conscience first, and then the Pope afterwards. For those not Catholic, they often, especially in the days of Newman, that they thought or had this idea that a Catholic had to absolutely and fully obey anything and everything the Pope may say. Newman challenged that idea, especially saying that we must be responsible to our conscience first. If we have formed our conscience to follow God, and any outside agent tells us to go against that, we need to be responsible to our conscience first, to obey our conscience first. Does this mean that conscience is absolute? That it is always the decider? Not at all. We talked last class about education and formation being necessary to help us exercise the virtue of prudence. It is especially necessary in the formation of the conscience. We have to form our conscience in accord with what? In accord with truth. Why? When the whole goal of human life is the pursuit of the truth, to obtain it and to live it out. Obviously, we may have arguments and distinctions about what is truth. But that is what we ultimately pursue. We want to know how things are as they really are. What defines life, the universe, everything? So it is then that our conscience is that first compass pointing us towards the truth, orienting us towards that goal. Not just in an intellectual way, but in a moral way, in our actions. Because that truth is meant to be translated into how we act, what we do, what we don't do. If we believe these things are the truth, we need to pursue them. If these are not the truth, we need to avoid them. And our conscience helps us do that. But if we ignore our conscience and pursue that, we will begin to transform our conscience, to begin to rewrite it. That instead of these things being the truth to pursue, it becomes these things. We can change our conscience. We can form it or deform it. We can manipulate and massage it, move it around, or completely reverse it. Conscience is kind of a middle term. Between truth and between authority. Naturally, we are called to obey authority, proper authority, as long as it does not lead us away from or towards that which we know is wrong or not to be done. But that is very much an outside voice and an outside agent. Truth, while being something outside of us, is something that we are meant to begin to grasp internally, intellect-wise. So conscience is kind of the in-between. The internal authority that processes the truth or directs us back to the truth. What agents have helped, or authorities have helped form your conscience up to this point? What's one example of that happening? First and foremost, always, right? We act the way we act, especially at your age, because of our parents. The first example that we have in everything. Parents, family. So our conscience is formed based on the example of others. What else? What other influences?
Teachers and professors.
Yes. Education, right? That as we begin to learn more about how the world works, how the world is, that begins to shape it. Perhaps it can cloud our conscience. Perhaps it can become too bitter, too satirical. What else? What other authorities or outside influence can shape our conscience? Yeah? Nature? How would you say nature can do that?
I would say, like, you take examples from, animals that we see in nature, like the environment itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they don't have some kind of form of conscience,
Mm-hmm.
you can see how we're different to them.
Okay. Yeah. Kind of some might call it the via negativa, the negative way. This is how we should not act, not to be so perhaps instinctive. Okay. Others.
How about those who we call friends or who we perceive as friends?
Mm-hmm. Probably the deepest impact probably the second deepest impact that has existed in your life up to this point has been the friends, the company you keep. Why? We can change. We will often change or go against our conscience because of the double P's. Peer pressure, right? We may know we should not do something, but our peers, those around us, especially our closest friends, may pressure us into doing something. Oh, we did it and it was fine, so why don't you do it? We all cheated on our test. Why don't you cheat? Why don't you do it?
Don't listen to those peers.
Of course. From that emerges that struggle, right? Our conscience says in that specific example, no, we should not cheat. We should do our own work. And yet, there is the division in the heart that says, we want the acclaim, or we want the approval of those around us. And they're all doing it. So if they're doing it, is it really as bad as I think it is? This is what sows the seeds of doubt in the conscience. Well, I thought this was the truth up to this point, and this is what authority has informed me, and yet I get this other influence. While we have, well, of course, especially looking at this in a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective, we have the revelation of the law of God in the commandments and in the Beatitudes and the teachings of Jesus. This does not mean that's the exclusive realm in which all of these things are revealed. We talk about that conscience as being the primeval law of God. That's inscribed in everyone. There are those common things, as we talked about before, that everyone agrees on. Despite culture, despite time, that all but perhaps the most warped or the most deformed of consciences would agree and say, yes, those are things that need to be done. In looking at this, a great passage to reflect on this in the scriptures is from the letter to the Romans. Chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. Paul, the apostle, writes, when Gentiles who have not the law, the revealed law of the Jews, do by nature what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. Some will try to argue that Christian morality is very much an outside thing. That just God putting it down on us. The principle of morality of obligation, as it were. God says that we are obliged to do this. Because this will be the only way that we can be able to be and to act. Yet the actual common experience of humanity shows otherwise, when looked at through the prism of Christianity. We are a law-seeking species. We desire order and law and rule, because we instinctively know this is what leads to our flourishment, to our success, more so than just chaos and randomness. And that is because of the conscience. A conscience that we have been given, that has been imprinted within us. And as a bird, this is the first voice that we must listen to. Anyone heard of the term conscientious objector? I'm never good at saying that specific word. What is a conscientious objector? I say that.
Someone who is forced to fight, they refuse to, like based on their beliefs and their conscience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. If there is a draft for one to enter the military, enter the service of the military, whichever branch it may be, there is the term conscientious objector. The one who objects to engaging in battle because, and that's where their conscience, in whichever way, says that they are opposed to taking up arms against another human being. Now, for the majority of those who have brought it up in history, it's usually a religious objection. That their religion, or their understanding of their religion, opposes the idea of engaging in armed conflict, of fighting and killing other human beings. Some may do this from a non-religious perspective. Some also may try to do this just to get out of military service. But why? Those who are serious about that have a duty to obey their conscience against that overarching authority. That though government, rightly so, an authority over them, tells them to take up arms, they say, I cannot disobey my conscience. I cannot go against it. Obviously, while we can change it, we are always and ultimately responsible to our conscience. At least on this side of the veil of mortality. Whatever you do as a moral agent, you're responsible to your conscience for. As I said before, your conscience knows what you're capable of. You know what you're capable of. You know what you can do, what you and what you shouldn't do. However you form that, whatever religion, whatever education, you know and understand that. But you have to live in accord with that conscience. You have to live with the consequences of your actions. Each one of us. Anything and everything that we do. The pangs of guilt, right? For failing to do what we should do. That comes from our conscience. That comes from this internal voice that says you should have done differently. Yes, we are ultimately, as we say in Christian morality, we are ultimately responsible to the just judge, the one who can read all hearts, God. And we say that for all human beings, not just those who believe God. But every human being will ultimately be responsible to God for their actions. But God does not, we believe, does not delay that judgment. He gives us a preview or an understanding of it through the conscience. We all experienced that in one way or another as a child, didn't we? But there was something that we wanted to do, but we were kind of stopped, as it were, or we struggled within ourselves to do it. Right? We can still find that nowadays. What's the biggest struggle in your life as students? What would you say is the biggest struggle in your life?
Working while also attending school.
Working while attending school? Others? Perhaps trying to understand the balance of work and recreation. You all, beginning to exercise your full adult responsibilities. You're able to have more freedom to do whatever you want. Or more so even in this COVID tide than perhaps you may have been used to, being a high school student or younger. Mom and dad aren't there to tell you to go to bed, to do your homework, to go to your, to pay your bills, to do your job. You have to do it for yourself. Right? Certainly you can ask for them, but they're not taking care of it right away. You are. One thing that most college students struggle with, that balance of responsibility and fun. How much can I do, or how little do I need to do to get by without intruding on what I want to do, what I would like to do. That can often be many of the ways we form that conscience for ourselves in the moment. By saying things such as, this is my true priority. My priority is to get through university. So I need to do my work first and foremost. And if that is done, if that is completed, then I can rest. Then I can enjoy myself. Or if all of my duties are done. Or to just say, well, I will do the minimum I need to do. But otherwise, just going to enjoy life while it's here. Conscience is not absolute. Why? Because we can shift our conscience. We can change it. Every choice that we make, one way or the other, either reinforces our conscience or begins to shift it. If we start saying work is useless, any sort of work, whether a job or whether our work here at university is really not that meaningful, we will begin to shift our conscience so that it does not, I'm trying to think how to phrase it. It does not, judge us so harshly. We'll say, well, there's no issue with me playing a video game in the middle of class. I don't see any issue with that, right? I think that's the most important thing, so that's what I will do. Or I will, skip class. Or I will, I will use the availability of, for example, in something like this, I'll use the availability of, the class is taped, so I can skip it. I can skip the next class. I'll watch it later. I'm going to do something more important. Our conscience may ping us a little bit and say, yeah, you shouldn't really do that. But if we're dead set against it, we will force that back. Say, nope, you're wrong. That's what I want. So then our conscience will kind of give up. Oh, okay, well, that's what you want. That's what you want, fine. So yes, we have a responsibility to our conscience. First and foremost, we always do. But conscience is not so absolute that it cannot change. Some will try to say that, I gotta be me. I gotta be me. No, that's not ultimately true. You have to be truthful. You need to pursue the truth, which we as Christians and Catholics say is ultimately God. Your conscience should lead you to the truth, which should lead you to God. Truth is more important than goodness, even. We only know something is good because it is true. God is the ultimate good because God is true, we believe. The law is good because it is true. It reflects how things are supposed to be. So, if our conscience is leading us away from the truth, we need to rope it back to it. The practice of the virtues are there for us to find the truth and to live the truth. These virtues these initial virtues we're talking about are not, as I said before, are not exclusively Christian. They have been adopted, taken under the wing of Christianity, especially of Catholicism. Why? Because they're true. It's true that we need temperance. It's true that we need prudence. It's true that we need justice. It's true that we need fortitude. There is more than that, but those are still true. Why? Because our conscience tells us that. Our conscience tells us we need to be prudent. We need to rightly discern and rightly apply ourselves, to rightly temper ourselves, to be just towards others, to have fortitude in practicing what we need to practice. In all of those things. But, however, the revelation of God, God speaking to humanity, further illuminates the truth that is meant to illuminate our conscience, to help our conscience blossom and flourish. So while there is some absoluteness to the conscience, that it is something that must be obeyed on, at the same time, it is not so absolute that it cannot change or improve or devolve. John Henry Newman, kind of reflecting on this, struggled with his own conscience. He was born in 1801. He grew up as an Anglican. He desired and pursued the truth of the question of, what is the full truth of the Christian faith? Is it Anglicanism? Is it some other branch of Protestantism? Is it Catholicism? He originally thought Anglicanism was a middle way between the excesses of the two, versus Catholicism, or even the more evangelical branches, as he called them, of Protestantism. Not too much, not too little. But in his study, in his pursuit of the truth, he began to realize more and more that that was not the case. Anglicanism was not this middle way, but had diverted from the truth that he saw in Catholicism. And he struggled with that in his own conscience. But he ultimately saw that if this is the truth, if Catholicism is that truth, then his conscience must be directed towards the truth, not the truth directed towards his conscience. So in the midst of his struggle, he penned this poem, a hymn, as it were, as it's become, especially in many circles. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. This is why Newman is very much an agent talking about conscience, but also showing it not as the ultimate authority. Truth is the ultimate authority. There might be something for yourself to question of yourself as well. What is the truth that you are actually actively pursuing? You don't have to answer me. Unless I give you an assignment to do that, which I'm probably not going to do. You have to answer that self within yourself, for yourself. Where am I and my conscience leading me? What am I pursuing? Because it is the light of conscience that can only direct us, illuminated by truth. Thoughts, comments, questions? Jokes, puns, snide remarks? Nothing, Nathan? Your conscience pinging you into silence?
Yeah.
There you go. Overwhelmed by it all. All right. So, for Friday, for next class, read up on chapter 6. We're going to kind of look into how to apply these first two virtues, how to apply them in a specific way, in a specific example, for how to apply temperance and prudence, to apply them to the consumption of goods that are probably interesting to hear about from the perspective of university students. So read up on that, look on that, and we will come back and talk about it next class. See you then.